Good day, time travelers! I'm Unsilent, and I'm often asked what my favorite game of all time is. For most people, the answer to that question is one of the games that I've played or will play in future on the channel. My favorite game of all time is the one game that broke me out of my comfort zone. I grew up playing sports games, racing games, Star Wars games, other licensed direct Final Fantasies, mostly stuff that you'd expect a boy who liked sci-fi and sports to play. However, one review from a Canadian video game review show pointed me in the direction of what would become my favorite game of all time. Let's take a look back at the Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. Hello and welcome to the RETROspective, a series in which I look back at the great games of yesteryear that I've played, with the eventually, possibly, hopefully upcoming release of the remake of the Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. Now's the right time to look back on my favorite game of all time. The Prince of Persia series sees its origins date back to the 1980s. Development for the first game in the franchise began as far back as 1985, before the game's release in 1989. Prince of Persia was the second game developed by Jordan Mechner, whose first game was 1984's Karateka. While Karateka spent 2 years in development, Mechner spent 4 years working on Prince of Persia. The game sees the player take control of a nameless character, who we just assume is the titular prince, as he tries to escape a dungeon to rescue the Sultan of Persia's daughter from the clutches of the evil Vizier Jafar before the sands of time in an hourglass runs out and the princess is executed. While the effort and wait for Mechner's second game was considerable, the result was a game that was adored by gamers and critics alike. The game was praised for its great graphics and sound, with special mention often given to the animations. Prince of Persia was followed up by a sequel 4 years later called Prince of Persia 2: The Shadow and the Flame. While the game was very similar to the original, combat was given an even greater emphasis over the platforming and light puzzle solving of the original. That didn't turn off critics who gave it praise and awards, with some going so far as to say that the sequel was superior to its predecessor. However, the Prince of Persia franchise wasn't always among gaming's greats. 6 years after The Shadow and the Flame, the prince entered the third dimension with Prince of Persia 3D, also known as Prince of Persia Arabian Nights. This is the first entry in the franchise that didn't have Mechner at the helm of the game. Rather than design and lead development of the game as he did with the first two entries, Mechner's role was limited to consulting and writing the game's scenario. The rest of the work was done by developer Mindscape. Rather than charting the way forward for gaming, as was the case for the first two games, Prince of Persia 3D is a game that was informed by the legacy of its predecessors. On his website, when talking about 3D, Mechner specifically cites Tomb Raider as an inspiration that Mindscape and publishers Red Orb Entertainment were guided by. It's a full circle moment for the franchise, as the design document for 1996's Tomb Raider specifically mentions 1989's Prince of Persia as an inspiration, with the emphasis on animations and gameplay. Without Mechner at the helm, Mindscape put forward an effort that was considered forgettable at best and franchise killing at worst. It certainly caused Mechner to bow out of the gaming industry. Critics were definitely not impressed with the third effort in the franchise. While they appreciated the work done to bring some of the game's predecessor's core strengths forward into the 3D realm with good graphics, animation, and platforming, the game was rushed out the door. The corporate bosses above Red Orb, that being the learning company who bought out Broderbund Software, the original publishers of Prince of Persia, didn't seem to put enough time, money, or interest into quality assurance, which resulted in a game that had some significant bugs, some of which were game-breaking. Some critics pinned the blame for the underwhelming game at the feet of the scenario penned by Mechner, claiming that he ignored the ending of The Shadow and the Flame for something more akin to a reboot. From there, Prince of Persia lay dormant until the remnants of Broderbund eventually ended up in the hands of Ubisoft in 2001. However, the Prince of Persia IP was still controlled by Mechner. So while Ubisoft owned the back catalog of games, they couldn't do anything new with the Prince of Persia franchise without Mechner's approval. That didn't stop them from trying. The the task was assigned to Yanis Malat, then a producer at Ubisoft's Montreal studio. He and a small team started working on ideas for a new Prince of Persia, with the goal of being able to sell not only their bosses up the corporate ladder on revisiting the franchise, but its creator as well. Malat met Mechner at E3 2001 to give him the elevator pitch. That was enough to pique the creator's interest to be willing to see what Team Pop had put together for the new game. Then the team had to make something they could sell Mechner on. To do so, Malat scrapped his original pre-production team and brought on a new crew only weeks before the Mechner presentation. Fortunately, that new team had the right ideas, chief of which was the movement. Inspired by the likes of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and The Matrix, players would go far beyond the running and jumping that was the movement style of the 2D Prince of Persia games. The movement style of the Prince was described to the team as acrobatic. From the earliest days of development, the Prince was able to run along walls, run up walls, and swing on bars. While the acrobatic movement wasn't fully fleshed out this early on, it was enough to impress Mechner into approving the project and coming on board as part of the team. Coming back to the Prince of Persia franchise, the Pop team had some key pillars of the original games that would be brought forward and used as key pillars that would support the new Prince of Persia game. The level design, animation, puzzles, and fighting were all the team's highlights from the first game and were used as the key pillars supporting the new game. And focus on these aspects Team Pop did. The Prince alone had almost 800 unique animations that allowed his actions to be smoothly stitched together. Puzzles come in two varieties. There are the standard tricky moments where you have to solve a traditional video game puzzle in order to progress. In addition, levels were designed in such a way that navigating them was a puzzle in and of itself, or acrobatic puzzles, as it has been called in some articles and by the devs themselves. The last piece I mentioned was fighting, because that was the last pillar to be finalized. While the team had a clear vision for the movement, they couldn't quite come up with an exciting concept for the combat. Eventually, some team members said, if the Prince can run up walls, why can't he run up some enemies too? That led the team down a path that saw the integration of the acrobatics into the combat and influenced the style of fighting. Rather than a more fencing or sword dueling style from Mechner's early Prince of Persia games, he now moved with a smoothness, a style, a grace, similar to how he moved out of the fights. So while the movements are based on the similar Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon inspiration, the fighting finds its grounding in the Brazilian martial art of capoeira. You occasionally see it in MMA, though it's obviously not as ubiquitous as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The party piece of the game was right there in the title of the game, The Sands of Time. However, would it surprise you to find out that the game wasn't built around time manipulation mechanics, but rather that it was a later edition? According to Patrice Desilets, the game's creative director, the difficulty of some early platforming sections resulted in the inspiration to create the time rewind mechanic to cope with the frequency of player deaths during those platforming sections. It was an idea that Desilets had going back to working on Donald Duck Going Quackers. While it was dismissed on that game, Malat was much more open to that given the gameplay elements of Prince of Persia. With that in mind, the idea was handed off to the programming team, which added that as another element to their decision of which game engine to use as an underpinning. The Unreal Engine was an early favorite for the game, but the decision was made to go with the Jade Engine, made by Ubisoft Montreal studio for Beyond Good and Evil. While implementing a rewind feature on consoles, now nearing 20 years old, was a daunting task, the rewind feature was working flawlessly by the time the first prototype was shown to executives in March 2002, some 20 months before the game hit store shelves. Granted, a core gameplay element isn't something that you'd want to wait until the last minute to get working. Desilets credits programmer Martin Sevigny with figuring out the programming of the feature. According to Patrice, they dedicated about 2 of the PlayStation 2's 32 megabytes of RAM to the rewind feature, which gave them about 8 seconds of rewind time. It doesn't sound like much when you say it out loud, but it seems just about perfect when using it in action. And with the inclusion of a rewind mechanic, it had to be explained in the story. After a chat at a hockey game, HAL Montreal, that was taken up by Mechner. Thanks in part to his time spent in film school, Mechner had a particular philosophy about the story in a video game. The story had to work in service of the gameplay. The story sequences couldn't show or do things that you can't already observe or do in the gameplay. So Mechner's story focused on explaining why you're doing what you're doing in the game. That is to say, the story of the game was fairly streamlined down to ensuring that you knew where to go and why you're going there. It's an interesting juxtaposition to 2003's big award winner, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. In that game, the story is the focus, with the gameplay there in service of getting you to your next story beat. From Ubisoft handing the game off to Malat and the Montreal studio to the release of the game was about 30 months, and even then there were concerns that it wouldn't release in 2003. Both Mechner and Desailly thought the game should have been pushed to 2004 to have it properly finished. After the game's impressive showing at E3 2003, the bosses set a fall 2003 release date in stone. While the team considered splitting Sands of Time into two parts, they settled on cutting the scope of the game by an estimated 15 to 20%, with levels early in production or not up to standard getting cut. The biggest cut may have been a series of boss battles against a griffin. It was to be featured in 3 battles throughout the game, only being defeated at the end when the player has a powerful enough sword to finally defeat it. While that was cut in 2003, the Griffin and a similar enemy concept came back for the next game, Prince of Persia Warrior Within, which was released in 2004. So how did the game actually turn out? I did mention off the top that it is my favorite game of all time, so I'm inclined to say pretty damn well. That said, I did play through it again for this retrospective to refresh myself. For the most part, I'd say the game aged pretty well. Okay, the graphics didn't age too well. While the environments still look great, the enemy models lacked in variety in terms of the number of different enemies and the lack of variation in appearance between the enemies you encounter. Okay, that hasn't changed too much over the years. Upscaling the resolution on PC impacts the character models more than the appearance of the environment, though everything suffers a little from jaggedness or edginess as you'd expect from upscaling to modern resolutions. The cutscenes suffer worst in terms of aging. Being pre-rendered videos, playing the game on modern equipment and higher resolutions won't improve the quality of a pre-rendered cinematic. So you get to see these in all their original 480p glory. I remember them looking great in 2003 on a big old CRT TV, but they showed their age in 2022. Granted, there aren't too many cinematics as most of the story beats happen in-game or at least in-engine. But on the whole, the graphics survive the upscaling and resolution. The environments have this wonderful dreamlike look, a little soft focus, which is the opposite of what one would expect when upscaling, as was the case with some of the character models, the glow off the swirling sands of time, a beautiful oasis of a palace crumbling in a golden age apocalypse, all in eerie silence and emptiness in what would otherwise be a busy center of power and opulence. Even without the scads of cutscenes and dialogue interludes, the game can tell its story just through the environment. Speaking of which, the environment is the real star of this game. While the game switches back and forth between platforming and combat in a metronome diligently keeping time, and therefore balance, of the game's elements, it's the acrobatic puzzles that are the star of this game. While scrambling up walls and sliding along small edges is a dime a dozen in modern gaming today, there's an elegance to how it was done in the game that brought it to the fore. The controls are responsive, the animations are gorgeously smooth, and the world level and camera designs all work in conjunction to point you in the right direction and highlight where to make the spectacular leap from a wall run over a gap to your next piece of acrobatic artistry. You see, the world has little highlights to let you know when to make a jump or where to wall run, usually a mark on the wall or a trick of the lighting. Sometimes they augment this with a particular camera movement to help you line up. It's a subtle way to eliminate the trial and error that might otherwise have been necessary to clear the acrobatic puzzles without using all of your Sands of Time rewind powers. Personally, and I don't think this is an uncommon opinion, the platforming is the highlight of the game. Almost 2 decades removed, someone playing this for the first time probably won't see what was so special about this game. It's pretty similar to a lot of the third-person action-adventure platforming that you see in the likes of Uncharted, Tomb Raider, or Assassin's Creed. However, it was the Sands of Time that did it first. In some ways, it still does it better than its successors with the smart camera usage, responsive controls and animations, the rewind feature, and the relative lack of obvious signposting of platformable areas that stick out of the rest of the environment like the proverbial sore thumb. In 2003, Prince of Persia's platforming felt revolutionary. Maybe playing this game today would still feel evolutionary to new players, and that's damn impressive for a game that's old enough to drink in its developer's hometown of Montreal. As mentioned earlier, the combat evolved from the platforming movement, so what the Pop team did was contextualize the movement controls based on whether you had your sword and the dagger of time unsheathed and were ready to do battle. So while your wall running was tied to R1, or your equivalent button on non-PlayStation 2 consoles, while platforming, when your weapons were out, that was the block button. Your acrobatic maneuvers were changed and limited. No more running up or along walls. Instead, pushing X would bounce you off a wall to spring back at enemies for a spearing attack or float over them to reposition yourself. However, push X while moving at an enemy, and now you're running up and over the enemies, allowing you to get behind them and slice them with your sword or the dagger of time. It took me a while to reacquaint myself with these controls, and there were times where I wished I could wall run vertically or laterally to get out of a hairy situation without leaving myself defenseless. That said, the combat can feel a little samesies at times, even with all the tricks at your disposal. There are about 16 different varieties of enemies that all have to be defeated in almost entirely the same way. You beat down enemies until they're on the ground so you can suck out their sands to recharge your dagger of time. There are some variations to that. You could counter an attack into sand suckage or vault an enemy into sucking their sands. Fortunately, different enemies block and are vulnerable to different attacks. Combine that with the different environments you find yourself in, the different enemy mixes and their ability to warp around the field of battle, and you have battles that might feel generic at face value, but never play out the same way twice. And they're hard. I found the combat to be significantly more difficult than I remember, and considerably harder than the platforming. Now, it's been since Assassin's Creed Revelations that I last played an Assassin's Creed game, so this is going off a decade of memory. And disclaimer aside, I recall the Assassin's Creed games having a very defensive combat play style. Block, push, counter, repeat. Sands of Time really does feel the opposite. There's a rhythm and style to the combat. While Prince of Persia's combat segments can be long, violent, drag-out brawls, there's a dance happening as the prince spins, strikes, flips, swipes, flies, and spears the sand creatures. The beauty and smoothness of the movement for platforming was the same that could be found in the combat. Even if the combat segments felt like they were slowing me down from getting to the next platforming section, I could still do most of the cool and beautiful tricks from the platforming section while engaging in combat with the sand creatures, allowing me to incorporate what I found fun in the other sections of the game and play the style I wanted to. Of course, the Dagger of Time also brings some new tricks to combat. In addition to the rewinding and slowing of time that I frequently used while platforming, there are a couple of new abilities to help defeat the sand creatures. You can freeze an enemy in time, leaving it both unable to attack and defend itself. You can just leave it alone so it stays out of the fight and unable to be replaced, or you can give it the old double slash to eliminate it. There's also what is functionally your ultimate combat move, in which you use all of your sand reserves to freeze all enemies and zip between them to quickly slash them out of existence. It's a really cool move, but only for use in the most dire of circumstances. As I mentioned earlier in playing through the game again for this review, other than a couple of tricky sections, I found the platforming to be easier than the combat. I used far more rewinds and had more game overs from the combat than the platforming. That's not to say one element is better than the other. However, that does explain why I preferred the platforming sections. Also, funny little note, since you spend most of the game in possession of the Dagger of Time, they didn't come up with an animation for sheathing your weaponry that didn't involve putting away the dagger, so every time you put away your weapons at the end of a fight, it's the same animation. Nearly 800 animations, but this is the one they forget! Another thing worth noting about the combat is that you never have more than 4 opponents to deal with at a time. Bats accepted. That's because of hardware limitations of consoles in 2003. As noted earlier, Mechner didn't want the story doing or showing something that you couldn't do in the game. However, The early story cinematics were the exception to the rule, with vast battles or whole hosts of people featured in a cutscene, which is something that the game in-engine couldn't handle. The gaming hardware of the time, be it PC or console, couldn't handle massive crowds. Part of the reason why there are so many crowds in Assassin's Creed is because Patrice Désilets wanted to make up for the lack of crowds here in this game. Because The Sands of Time was developed before the advent of the achievement, I can't really talk about the challenge of 100%ing the game. That said, the closest equivalent is collecting some of the various secrets you can find along the way. While they aren't usually difficultly hidden, there are glowing sand clouds and magic fountains for you to seek out and power you up. Collecting enough sand clouds will grant your dagger an extra sand tank, which gives you more charges to use your time powers. The magic fountains increase your health hit points by drinking from them. While the sand clouds tend to be harder to find than the magic fountains, both have audio cues for the astute listener to follow. And the magic fountains have a nice little narrative element, where they vanish after using them. In fact, if you use one with your traveling companion Farah accompanying you, she won't have any idea that you went for a drink from the fountain, and she will say that you never disappeared for any length of time.
Farah, how long have I been gone?
Gone? What are you talking about?
Never mind.
A trick of the Sands of Time, perhaps. Maybe it's some strange magic powerful enough not to be influenced by the various Sands of Time immune items our three main characters hold. Oh yeah, speaking of main characters, there's a story in here too. It's easy to forget that this game has a narrative thread to explain why you're wall running your way through a crumbling castle or why glowing monsters are trying to kill you. Video games are often a balance of the story and the game. Some prefer a strong story with gameplay elements that are just meaty enough to give you something to do as the narrative progresses. Others are perfectly content if the story didn't exist at all. As previously mentioned, Jordan Mechner's philosophy was that the story served the gameplay, so having a strong game to play was the primary focus of Mechner and the Pop team. The story is pretty straightforward. King Shahraman and his men attack the kingdom of an Indian Maharaja with the help of that kingdom's vizier. After capturing the kingdom, the king's men avail themselves of the Maharaja's treasures, including an hourglass with the Sands of Time. The vizier wants but one prize, the Dagger of Time, but it has already been claimed by Shahraman's son, the titular prince. So the vizier hatches a second plan to get his desired dagger. When Shahraman's caravan stops in the kingdom of Azad, the vizier, not content with betraying one monarch, tricks the prince into releasing the Sands of Time from the hourglass. The unleashed Sands of Time then infect nearly everyone and everything in the palace of Azad, turning them into sand monsters. One of the few survivors, Farah, a daughter of the Indian Maharaja whose kingdom was just sacked by our heroes, tells the prince his actions and the impact of unleashing the Sands of Time can be undone by inserting the dagger back into the Hourglass of Time. From there, the prince and his at first uneasy new companion set forth to find the hourglass to put the sands back into it, while the vizier passively attempts to thwart them or something. He's evil, but you don't really deal with him except at the very beginning and the very end of the game. Along the way, you get all your standard story tropes. There's a love story, a betrayal, perseverance, sacrifice, all those good things that you expect from an action movie style of game. The real highlight is how it's told. The game had a 1001 Nights inspiration to not only the story, but the way it was presented. The prince narrates his own tale from the future. He drops little jokes and hints along the way because he's recounting his harrowing tale of time doing battle with time. That's complete with moments when the prince dying on screen and him going,
Wait. That's not how it happened. Now where was I?
So while the prince is supposed to survive the story, they have a little fun with it along the way. This way of telling the story also has a fun way of coming back full circle by the end of the game. Normally, I'm a fan of a meatier story in a video game, but I still like the story in this game. The gameplay was always supposed to be the star of Sands of Time. As I've mentioned earlier, the gameplay is so amazing for the time period it came out that there's no reason why it shouldn't be front and center. Could the story have been better? Sure, but it works perfectly well in service of the rest of the game. It keeps coming back to that philosophy, doesn't it? Something I had forgotten over the last 19 years was the music of this game. The music was composed by Stuart Chatwood of the Canadian rock band The Tea Party. The band had some Middle Eastern musical influences, which explains how Chatwood was selected to score The Sands of Time, and why he was the right choice for the Prince of Persia games. All of them between 2003 and 2008, in fact. While I most closely associate the music of the sequel, Warrior Within, with heavy metal music, there's a rock guitar undercurrent to the Sands of Time soundtrack that drives the action in the combat sequences. With all the other bright points to this game, this is an oft-overlooked highlight of the game. It wasn't all sunshine and lollipops playing through it again. The big issue I had replaying the game was the camera. The first thing that you might blame is using a third-party mod to play the game in a modern widescreen 1920 by 1080 resolution, and that certainly didn't help. So I decided to go back and play the PlayStation 2 version again, and did find a few camera problems there, though fewer than the PC version with the modded widescreen support. The camera issues revolved around the camera getting caught on the environment. The world was populated with all sorts of architectural and decorative elements to use as a platforming puzzle, but they were also real, solid objects that would actually impede the camera. Obviously, over the last nearly 2 decades, cameras in third-person action-adventure and platformer games have gotten better. I didn't remember there being an issue playing the game the first time, because I had never played anything like this before. So at the time, the camera was perfectly adequate. It's also important to note that the camera isn't solely player-controlled. It also pans and zooms to create a cinematic feel and to help guide the player. The pop team move the camera around to highlight where you need to go or how to platform there. They also move it about in combat to help you keep all of your enemies in sight. So it's not perfect, but it's not hopelessly clunky either. Little problems aside, Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was absolutely amazing in 2003, and still holds up amazingly well in 2022. I don't think I could sum it up any more accurately than that, even if I was more verbose with my summary of the game as a whole. I can absolutely confirm that it's not coasting by on its reputation when you see it on those greatest games of all time lists. This game was the real deal 19 years ago, and it can still go toe-to-toe with games that it has inspired over the last 2 decades. I'm not the only one who loved this game either. It received aggregated review scores in the 90s on consoles. In fact, it's number 29 on Metacritic's list of the best PlayStation 2 games, and 11th when you remove sports and fighting games from that list. While it scored the official E3 Game of the Year award, it only scored one year-end Game of the Year award. That's probably because 2003 had a decent crop of games at the top end. That was the year we first saw Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Call of Duty, and Beyond Good and Evil, while The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker came out in December 2002, so it scooped up a bunch of 2003 awards. There was also Ratchet & Clank 2, Final Fantasy X2, SmackDown Here Comes the Pain, Madden 2004, and Tony Hawk's Underground that also have popular legacies. While the critical acclaim for Sands of Time was spectacular, the sales weren't as blockbuster big, but good enough to see Prince of Persia continue on with what is now known as the Sands of Time trilogy. The franchise got annual releases for the next 2 years with Warrior Within and The Two Thrones. However, the series seemed to lose its way during the trilogy, and so did Ubisoft's plans for the franchise. 3 years after the trilogy concluded, Prince of Persia was rebooted again with 2008's Prince of Persia. That game ended with a conclusion setting up a sequel, but the game's follow-up was limited to one piece of DLC and nothing further. Ubisoft went back to the Sands of Time well again in 2010 with an interquel, so to speak, appropriately or maybe ironically called The Forgotten Sands, set in the time between the Sands of Time and Warrior Within. I might come back to the rest of these games at a later date. Spoiler, I really liked Pop 2008. And this doesn't include a few mobile games that are also part of the franchise, including a 2D Metroidvania-style port of the Sands of Time for the Game Boy Advance. I played a bit for this video. It's actually not too bad, but it might have been considered a hit if it was a standalone game rather than appearing to be a port, as the name would imply. Not mentioned above was the creation of a spin-off series from the Sands of Time that forms part of this game's legacy. After completing work on the Sands of Time, Patrice Désilets started work on a spin-off that featured the player as a female assassin protecting a prince with magical powers in Jerusalem. The project was codenamed Prince of Persia Assassins. Ubisoft didn't have much interest in a Prince of Persia game where you didn't play as the prince. but they didn't kill the idea. Instead, Desailly took about 20 members of the original Team Pop to work on his spin-off idea as a new IP that would become Ubisoft's next anchor franchise, Assassin's Creed. And the reason why I'm talking about The Sands of Time now is because Ubisoft was about to release a remake of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. It was originally due to be launched in January 2021 before an announced delay that would have pushed it back to March. Then it was delayed indefinitely before getting the new release window of Ubisoft's 2022-2023 fiscal year. The new game is being developed by Ubisoft's Mumbai and Pune studios. Given the delays, it probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that this is the first time these studios are leading development on a game. On the technical side, though, they've made the right choice by making the game on Ubisoft's Anvil Next 2 engine. The Anvil line of engines are the engines of choice for the Assassin's Creed games, which, as I just mentioned, started life as a concept for a Prince of Persia spin-off. Oh yes, and there was the 2010 movie based on the game. Sure, it had Jake Gyllenhaal and Gemma Arterton, but it also had Alfred Molina, who does his damnedest to single-handedly make something of the movie, and Ben Kingsley, who might just have the worst taste in movie roles in Hollywood since winning his Oscar. Well, him or the last 15 years of Robert De Niro. Anyway, while Prince of Persia was supposed to be a new Disney tentpole movie, a Prince of Persia movie franchise never happened due to poor critical reception and disappointing box office returns, especially domestically. And most importantly to me, this is my favorite game of all time. It was unlike anything I ever played before. I mentioned off the top that I was stuck in my rut of sports and sci-fi and never really explored beyond that. It was this game that pushed me to play more critically acclaimed games rather than the same old same as I was doing. That was helped along by my usual weekend morning viewing of Electric Playground and Reviews on the Run with Victor Lucas and Tommy Tallarico. I still remember the Reviews on the Run review of Sands of Time being hyped for the entire episode, with the payoff being the game scoring the first ever pair of 10 out of 10s on the show, and Tommy running around a hockey rink excitedly as a result. They compared NHL 2004 and ESPN NHL hockey at the top of the episode, so the hockey rink was an appropriate setting for the episode. Fun fact, Tommy was actually the music composer for the Game Boy version of the original Prince of Persia. Other fun fact, I've played both those hockey games on the channel too. I still like Prince of Persia more than those games. And speaking of gaming luminaries fond of Prince of Persia, Ben Yahtzee Croshaw, of Zero Punctuation fame, also lists The Sands of Time as his favorite game. Probably doesn't speak well to his taste if he agrees with me on that. But this is where we leave you for this retrospective on The Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time. Have you played this or any of the subsequent Ubisoft Prince of Persia games? What did you think of it? Leave your thoughts and memories in the comments below. And until we see you for more of the retrospective and other looks back at classic video games, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you're new, share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent On Air, and that is for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And don't forget, there's plenty more looks at the great and not so great in retro gaming in the playlists there on the screen, in the description down below, and more videos anytime on the channel page. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.